Hello, this is just a sharing of a little bit of the Zoom that we had this afternoon on the subject of faith and art in conversation. And it's going to be a little bit like last week if you've watched the first week, in that we'll have three works of art. Now, in the first week it was three bits of art that really very much were immersed in buildings, architectural features actually. A mosaic, a dome of a church, and a lighting installation in a church. This week it's, well, there are two paintings and then a sort of a sculpture actually, but you'll see these in a minute. And what I've offered for you is really just a very poor sort of summing up of where we went in our discussion and a showing of these pictures of art with the commentaries on them. So I hope that's helpful to you, and certainly it was a great session. We found it really very interesting indeed. It all builds around the text in the prophet Isaiah, and that begins in chapter 52 about a servant who shall prosper, be exalted and lifted up, and shall be very high. But having had that extraordinarily strong introduction, it then moves immediately into saying that the servant was a suffering servant. As many were astonished at him, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the sons of men. So shall he startle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. Lots of things to puzzle over in this text, and of course in the fullness of time it became clear that Jesus in his going to the cross really had to undergo something of very much of what this suffering servant in the book of the prophet Isaiah had to undergo. And it became a very rich text. It comes back in Acts chapter 8, but in the conversation between Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. But anyway, we've got three artists who have sat with this text, beginning in Isaiah chapter 52 and moving into chapter 53, and have reflected on how they wanted to create works to allow us to think about this, to talk about it, to know what it means for us. So I recorded the Zoom and I'll just put that on now. So this is a shortened version of a Zoom conversation that some of us had this afternoon around some pictures of the suffering servant. Now, the Bible text in the background today is from the book of Isaiah, beginning in the last verses of chapter 52 and reading into chapter 53. And as you'll hear in the little introduction by Ben Quash, this is a text, a very famous text, and not just the Old Testament, but for us as Christians, which talks about how God, acting in the strength of his arm, is to be seen acting in the one who suffered as a servant. A one who suffered with no attractiveness to look at. In fact, it was quite a shocking sight to see his suffering. And yet his suffering was for us. His suffering was for us. I'm going to play Ben Quash's introduction to help us into today's subject.
Welcome to this second week of Lent, in which our theme is prophecy. And our text comes from one of the great prophetic books of the Bible, the book of Isaiah, chapter 53, in which we're introduced to the figure who's often called the suffering servant, a figure whom Christians have read over many centuries as a prefiguration of Christ. The suffering servant is a fascinating figure. He's both repellent, his sufferings are so extreme, and it's said of him that he had no beauty that we should desire him. And yet the text seems to associate his sufferings with a sort of offering on behalf of others. He suffers partly for others' transgressions, and in doing so makes intercession for them, making prayers for their sake. And that at another level, beneath this superficial horror, is something that is commended in the text as a proper source of admiration. Modern artists have always had a complex relationship with the idea of beauty. It can too often seem like a false consolation to make works of art that simply give pleasure. And that's perhaps why the figure of the crucified Christ, and perhaps too the figure of the suffering servant in Isaiah, speak very powerfully to modern artists, whether or not they're Christian, because their art too has been an invitation to look more deeply than just our desire for sensory reward, and actually to ask bigger questions and more profound questions about what matters and what will endure. And all three of the works that we'll share with you this week, as we also think about Isaiah 53, do what, in its own particular way, Anish Kapoor's work, one of the three, does, which is to create a slit in the surface of things, like the wound of Christ, and to invite us, like Thomas, to feel our way beyond the surface towards something more deep, more lasting, and perhaps too more challenging, as we think about how it is that real beauty manifests itself in the complex, difficult, and violent world of human affairs.
That was a very helpful introduction, especially that last question. How does real beauty show in this world in which we live? How does the real beauty of what Jesus did on the cross for us shine for us? It's not something that we feel attracted to look at head on, and yet again and again Christian artists have said, well, this is so important. It is so important for us to recognize what Jesus did on the cross. And so I'm going to bring up these three works of art, one in each in their turn, and we'll have a look. Sadly, we're not going to have the very rich discussion that we had when we were all together, because there are all kinds of tangents that fly off, but I'll try and help us keep together. So again, I'm going to share the screen to show you the works of art. So this is the first one, and it's a painting. It's a painting called The Agony of Sacrifice. And I could zoom in on it as we did earlier. You can see that there looks like almost like barbed wire going through the picture. But then the other striking thing that you might notice is that, well, we know we're doing a Bible study, we know that the subject is the suffering servant, we know the subject is Jesus on the cross, and we can see Jesus on the cross there, I think. But actually, we can also see this not looking unlike a tree. In fact, looking very like a tree. And maybe if you've seen photographs of the Battle of the Somme or Passchendaele, what the kind of destruction that World War I brought on the landscape, and how trees were left bare like that in the middle of grim desolation. And as the commentator's just about to point out, of course, that rather unpleasant mustard yellow colour is very near in the background. So the commentary that we heard went like this, and I wonder if this helps you. Or now, you don't, as I said last week with these works of art, it's not as if we all have to like these works of art or feel that they're saying things exactly as we would want them to be said. It's not just about for or against. It's more, can these help us think about what we need to think about.
The Agony of Sacrifice. Commentary by Jonathan Kersley Kate. Crucified Tree Form is one of a series of paintings produced by the artist following a period of grave illness, which had instilled in him a pressing need to paint a crucifixion image. In this desolate scene, we see body, cross, and tree fused into a single suffering whole, in a manner evocatively reflecting the description in Isaiah 53 of the suffering servant, a figure so stricken by afflictions that he incites revulsion, scorn, and horror. The face is blackened and featureless, the arms shattered, the legs a single solid mass embedded in some unspecified, indistinct landscape. The paint is applied in a scumbled, expressionistic manner, and the range of colours is minimal, the lurid yellow background evoking the putrefaction of death, contrasting starkly with the austere monochrome of the figure. The anachronistic edition of Barbed Wire deliberately presents the painting in an ambiguous light. One can read it conventionally as a crucifixion, body broken, head bowed, the spikes of the barbed wire resolving into a crown of thorns. Alternatively, it might conjure the ruined landscapes and bomb-blasted trees of the battlefield, or else the mangled corpse of a soldier entangled in the barbed wire of no man's land. This is not an uncommon analogy to draw. In times of war, the crucifixion theme has often become an instrument of social criticism, the religious content perhaps supplanted, but perhaps also amplified by the force of the suffering, tortured body immolated on the altar of war. As Isaiah 53 tells us, if the servant suffers and dies, led like a lamb to the slaughter, cut off from the land of the living, he is also exalted. Thus, for the modern reader, parallels may be drawn with the ennoblement of the fallen soldier in the name of honour, sacrifice and duty. But so too, as the painting's subtitle implies, the narrative of the dutiful servant may be open to other, less generous readings, inevitably souring this particular paean to self-sacrifice.
Now, that commentary sparked a little bit of discussion earlier. I'm not sure that we were all persuaded that this necessarily was going to take us to think about just any soldier, for all that war does express something of the horror that people can bring upon themselves and upon this world, and indeed that is why Christ died. But it is a picture to linger with. It's a picture to certainly give us some contemplation of what Jesus did for us on the cross and how grim that was, and how we long for the victory over all that brought him to the cross. How we are thankful for the victory he has won over all that brought him to the cross. I'm not told that this artist was necessarily strongly Christian, that the only thing that we're absolutely sure about is that he was drawn to reflect on these things, having himself gone through heavy suffering. Questions arise, what is it all about, and what is beyond this? Let's go to the next picture. Next picture was a little bit testing for all of us. Testing, I mean, in the sense that I'm not sure that many of us were totally taken with it. It's very different. Let me just bring it up for you. Here we are. That's it. Now, what you're looking at is simply this bit of red cloth. Now, if we zoom in on it, you'll see that it's more or less square in shape, and it's got a little gouge in it, a cut. And up above it is, well, in this particular church in Germany, this is I don't know if you've been into a Catholic church, you maybe notice as people go in the door, there's usually what's known as a water stoop, a bowl with water in it, and people would normally dip their fingers in the water and make the sign of the cross on the forehead to remind them of their baptism. So this is for people as they come into the church. And if I just zoom in a minute more another time, you'll see, as we noticed earlier, that there's the floor, and that's the beginning of the wall. So what you're looking at is really very low down. It's actually really at child's height because this is really at, I suppose this would be more or less at waist height. Yes, so that's the work of art. As I say, we were just slightly wondering what to make of this. Definitely wondering whether we would want very much money to be spent on it. But yeah, let's hear the commentary. The Promise of Healing, it's called.
The Promise of Healing. Commentary by Jonathan Kersley Kate. Central to the theme of Isaiah 53 is the expiatory power of the servant's tribulations. We read, "But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that made us whole, and with his stripes we are healed." This verse goes to the heart of Christian interpretations in which the servant is read as Christ. It is given a potent yet simple visual representation, crossing from the Old Testament to the New in Anish Kapoor's The Healing of St. Thomas. As part of an installation for the Church of St. Peter, Cologne, Kapoor hung a red cloth, about a square metre and a half in size, beneath the holy water stoup. It had what appeared to be a small diagonal slit, but on closer inspection was in fact a little pouch or pocket that signified a stylized open wound. The hanging cloth had the look of a Mandilion or Veronica, a cloth or veil miraculously imprinted with the image of Christ, but one reduced to the metonym of a single gash, a kind of visual shorthand for the healing power of Christ's wounds. In a previous incarnation of this work, a slit was made directly into a gallery wall, but for St. Peter's, Kapoor felt this would imply too literal a response to the building, figuratively alluding to the church building as the body of Christ, whereas in Christian dogmatics, the church, as body of Christ, is the people. Instead, a red cloth was chosen as the bearer of the wound, becoming a site of spiritual and visual doubt. As the lesson of St. Thomas teaches us, it is by way of doubt that revelation and redemption may be found, just as, with Isaiah 53 in mind, it is via piacular rites of atonement, that healing comes.
Okay, so like I say, this was a wee bit of a challenge to us, but I mean, it is an interesting commentary. I mean, there's a number of things that she was saying there that maybe I hope it doesn't get too lost in the heaviness of the language. As I say, not many of us were totally persuaded by this, but what the commentator was saying was that, well, there's a wee bit of background. At some points in Christian history, in fact, for quite a lot of Christian history, we've been very much unsure whether we should have depictions of Christ, and certainly very unsure indeed whether we should ever have any depictions remotely of God, for very good reason. All kinds of commandments in the Old Testament about it. And we don't really know what Christ looked like. What we are told in Isaiah 53 is that, yeah, he wasn't there to be looked at. He wasn't there to be admired physically, aesthetically, beautifully. Rather, he was there suffering for us. And this cloth reminds us of Thomas before the risen Christ having said, I won't believe unless I can put my hand in his side and into the wounds in his hands. And so the cloth is reminding us of that story of which climaxes, of course, with Jesus saying, "Blessed are you for believing what you do, Thomas, but blessed are those who without seeing, still believe." And so the cloth is reminding us that we don't need to see the face of Christ. We don't need to see him in order to believe. So there's that crossover between doubt and faith. And the other thing that gets mentioned in the commentary is that in Catholic spirituality, and it's I don't know if you're aware of the story of Saint Veronica, and the story is that she wiped the face of Christ as he was carrying the cross on the way to Golgotha, and miraculously that face, that mark of the face of Christ, was imprinted on her cloth. And so in a lot of medieval art, there is a square piece of cloth on which is a human picture, as if that was Jesus's real face. Now, like I say, it's a slightly, I don't want to go into this at huge length, but in that kind of Catholic spirituality, there was a sense that how amazing it is to see the face of Christ. Well, again, this artist is saying, well, maybe not that critical to see the face. Critical, yes, to know the wounds. Critical, yes, to believe even without seeing. So I suppose that's really what this work of art is about, but it takes certainly a bit of explanation, and I'm not sure that that our group was just totally persuaded by its merits, but it's certainly interesting to think about, isn't it? And then finally, the last picture. A Man of Sorrows. So this is just the third choice of the people who have put together this exhibition this week on depictions of the suffering one, and this is made of bronze, so you can really see its kind of shininess and its very rough texture where the bronze has solidified. And we were looking at the way in which the hands are clearly our hands. And then you begin to imagine, as you look at the bronze, obviously the sinews and form. Can you imagine that there's an eye and a nose, except is there? It's a little bit almost produced by the liquid metal. Is that a rib cage, or again, has that just happened? And yet, as you go down to the bottom, you get what look very much like feet and even like toes. This is where we were just interested to look at it. People rather like the shininess of the material, and it's not a huge thing. It's only 45 centimeters in height. But what was rather interesting about this last one is that, whereas again it comes from a Catholic church, and in France this time, apparently when it was made in 1950, it was very quickly and immediately highly controversial. Now, Catholics are very used to having crucifixes of figures of the Christ on a cross, very used to having paintings of Jesus on the cross in their churches. But this one they didn't like. Certainly some did not like. Some, that is, leaders in the church, did not like. Let me play the commentary for you.
A Man of Sorrows. Commentary by Jonathan Kersley Kate. In the early 1950s, this sculpture for the Church of Notre-Dame de Toute Grâce, Assy, was at the centre of a cause célèbre known as La Querelle de l'Art Sacré, fought over the condemnation of corrupt and errant forms of sacred art that had found their way into Catholic churches. The work was ordered to be removed by the Bishop of Annecy in 1951 and only properly reinstated some 20 years later. It is a cruciform bronze sculpture of a desiccated, lacerated and near featureless figure, whose posture incorporates the cross into the figure of Christ, his outstretched arms effectively becoming the horizontal crossbar. Germain Richier's uncompromising aesthetic was derided by its critics as a scandalous profanation and sacrilegious defamation of sacred art. Yet, to those open to its devotional and liturgical potency, it presented a Christ strong, expressive, powerful, charged with humanity, and palpitating with love. Rubin, 1961-51. Indeed, although denounced by the Church as offensive to the faithful, it was vigorously defended by many parishioners, principally the patients and staff of several nearby sanatoriums, as this man of sorrows, so fraternal to their sufferings. Rubin, 1961-52. Those responsible for its commissioning, including the Dominican priest Father Couturier, seem perhaps to have anticipated a reactionary backlash, offering a scriptural precedent for the work on a placard accompanying the sculpture, justifying its unconventional form as the embodiment of Isaiah 53. For he grew up like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or comeliness that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Verses 2 to 3. Writing in defense of the work, Couturier was explicit. This tortured body, torn to shreds, rough as tree bark, twisted and bent, is the moving vision of Isaiah translated into a cast of bronze. Couturier, 1960, my translation.
So there you go. We certainly spent quite a bit of time trying to work out what the fuss was about. Perhaps partly to do with the fact that there's almost a suggestion that this body had been left on the cross for a long time to just wither away, as indeed crucified victims were usually. But we know, of course, in Jesus' story that he was taken down from the cross even before sundown and buried. But Father Couturier, who commissioned the art, really insisting that, if you read Isaiah 53 closely, this does work. And we had a good discussion about this. It's interesting, in the history of art, depictions of Jesus on the cross really didn't come into great fashion until about the 13th century. Before that, they were much more inclined either to use just symbols, letters even, the Chi-Rho symbol or the IHS symbol, or a fish or a good shepherd depiction. They didn't really tend to portray Jesus on the cross. But in the medieval period, from 12th, 13th century, they began to put Jesus on the cross, not least because, well, they had this desire that both people's feelings, compassion, understanding of how he had suffered for us would be prompted. Remember, this is a pre-literate society. People didn't have the Bible in their hands, but the church is wanting people to understand what Christ had done for them, how he had gone through such pain for them. And the depiction of Christ on the cross was meant to do that, and yet also at the very same time to give people a sense that the one who was on the cross looked out at them with compassion. And some of the depictions in art are very much of the one on the cross looking out at the viewer, saying, "This is for you." Now, whether by 1950 the church really didn't like the idea of such a, well, this figure doesn't have facial features, it's not quite the same. We really weren't just absolutely sure what all the controversy was about. But yeah, these things are worth just pondering, aren't they? It may not be exactly where we are in our desire for ornamentation in church or not, but it is people trying to understand, trying to see better what it meant that this one suffered for us. This one prospered ultimately. It was exalted and lifted high. Who at first was so startling to behold, so shocking to look at. I don't know that in the flesh I could have borne looking at someone being crucified, the agony, the horror of it. And maybe this sculpture evokes that, reminds us of that. So that was our three works of art, and we have just at the end a sense of how they all lie together. That one rather like a tree, this strange cloth, and this very, very thin bronze figure. And in comparative commentary, well, it's really just giving us room to ponder, to think about what we see and what we don't see, what we need to know, what speaks to us. I don't know if any of these works of art hit the spot for you, or certainly they'll give you something to remember and to reflect upon. But I do encourage you also to read Isaiah 52 verse 12, verse 13 rather, on into chapter 53 of Isaiah, and just to be reminded how the outward appearance was certainly not the last word of what Jesus did on the cross. He won this victory over sin and over death. So I shall stop the Zoom there.